Thank you very much. It's actually just me. Ferdy was warned prior to this by my colleagues that it's almost impossible to get a word in edgeways between me and a microphone. So he's gladly ceded his time to me. Uh, and it's odd because I had like a 20-minute talk, and now I realize I have a little bit longer, which is not a situation that I usually find myself in. So I'm either going to be speaking more slowly or faster, depending on how my brain thinks about that. I guess to give some contextual introduction, I'm Senior Fellow at the Filecoin Foundation and the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. I think ungrammatically my title is Senior Fellow for DWeb and Strategy. And a lot of what I do is try to think about how some of the tooling and capabilities that the technologists are building in our wider ecosystem can fit in with the public and social good. I am, as many of the people who don't work on these projects, acutely aware of the social and public goods of MIT's work in open learning. I think we've mentioned before that the founder, I guess, of the creator of the original idea of the core technologies we build, which is the interplanetary file system, which is a decentralized file distribution system, and Filecoin itself, which is an incentivized store, were developed by Juan Bennett. Juan grew up in Mexico City and credits his ability to build these tools and go on to work on them from sitting and binging open courseware from Mexico City. So that's one of the reasons why it's more than an honor to be here. I too have lost many hours, perhaps less usefully, watching MIT's materials. One of the reasons why I know some of the people here today is because I binged the structure and interpretation of computer programs, which is, yes, you have your fans in the land. And I see that really as kind of the perfect kind of nerd sniping. Right? For those of you who don't know that term, nerd sniping is where you give a puzzle that is just so attractive and interesting to a problem-solving mind, they immediately switch all of their attention and work on that to the detriment of the rest of their life. And what is successful education if not successful nerd sniping, right? Like the moment where you know that you're successfully distributing knowledge is where something where you're not cracking the whip so much as seeing an individual motivated by themselves to solve this little puzzle that has been put in front of them using the knowledge that is just either side of that problem. I come here not to praise decentralized technologies and not to bury it either, maybe to clumsily reanimate it, because decentralized technology has been around for a long time, and MIT and the various sort of computer science and technology institutions that built the internet and some of the thinking behind it was some of the engines of that explosion in thought about how we can build decentralized systems in the late 60s, 70s, and onward. But there are challenges. And I think one of the challenges, one of the things that keeps me up at night is maybe this is just an exercise in nerd sniping, right? Like decentralizing tools and technology is a particularly captivating problem, right? You have a system that is relatively easy to make if you have a central governor, if you have a central control, but very intriguing to try and build if you don't have that. What would happen if we just chop that head off, right? And that's the sort of thing that can lead to a million PhDs, a lot of thought, a lot of complexity, but potentially few practical implementations, because you go out into the real world and everybody looks at it and says, well, what if we just put that head back on? It would be a lot more easy. Is this something that we're just driving purely out of technical curiosity? I think if you look back in the context of that environment, it becomes, and you look at the situation that we find ourselves in the present day, you realize that no, this is not a technical solution to a technical problem. This is an attempt to craft a social solution to a growing social problem. I think one of the things that people always throw at the internet was that it has its basis in the military-industrial complex. It's something that every institution that was connected to it and got its funding realizes. But I think that's actually one of the framings that you have to understand why it was built the way it was, not because it was complicit in what is the very definition of a command and control environment, but because there was a realization of both the limits of that model of having a military general tell everybody what to do, and of its social risks for an open society. The reason why so much energy was built in the 70s to create decentralizing technologies is because anyone who was involved in understanding the promise of digital technology realized the dangers of doing it in any other way. We see ourselves, I think, at this moment in a time of great pessimism about the promise of digital technology. But if you look back in the early literature of that period, it was also a very pessimistic time then. Like if you look at the presentation of computers in science fiction, they always had that model of the giant mainframe, right? The Star Trek episode where someone replaces Kirk with a computer and it all goes terribly wrong until he asks it, what is love or whatever. And a lot of the creation of the early internet was not just an attempt to craft a technical solution which was interesting, but one that was sufficiently resilient, flexible, responsive, secure, and private that you could build an open society on it. So the internet has sort of decentralization in its bones, but we do not live necessarily in a time where that promise has been fully exploited. In fact, what we've seen is the re-centralization of the internet, and a lot of the problems that are laid at the feet of the net, at least to some of its creators' eyes, come from that centralization. So why did that happen? Given the reeling promise that I've laid out, that the internet and decentralizing technologies allow you to build systems that are not fragile, right? There's no head to chop off. They are responsive because people can give feedback and build systems around it. If the network and the ecosystem does not comply with what they want, they can build and plug into it. That they are private, that you have the opportunity to not share data that you don't want the world to know, and that you have a nexus of power and control at your fingertips rather than having to go and ask the permissions of another. To weirdly quote Madonna, I suddenly realized as I said that. Given all of that promise, given all of that investment, given all of that academic and technical thought, why did things centralize up? And I think this goes back to the sort of spin, the flip side of nerd sniping, which is, well, that's all very well, but we could just put the head back on. It would be so much easier, right? Like we can build this technology. We can use these decentralized tools. If you lift the hood of any major tech company like Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple, underneath you see that they use all of the consensus systems, all of the fallback systems in their own internal systems, right? Because that's the only way you can scale these things up. It's just you don't get access to that. And I think that's because a centralized system is, I wouldn't say intuitive, but gets you 70% of the way there, 10%, I'm making up numbers here, of the cost of the complexity, right? You get 70% of the security, right? Like you get to have Google's sysadmins protecting your data, and maybe one day someone will break through that single giant feudal castle that all our data is held in, and massive incentives to do that, by the way. But up until that point, it will be safe. And similarly with privacy, right? Like, you know, I grew up on the internet at a time where, yeah, I kept my data private on my own mail server or what have you. But the constant updates, right? The constant like fear that at any point somebody would come and take that data. Security fits into that, but privacy fits into that too. So the 70% solution here is to, again, give all of that data and store that data and store those the authentication systems through a central ACL, right? A central list that Mark Zuckerberg is in charge of maintaining my contacts list, and the only cost of that is that Mark Zuckerberg is now on my contacts list, right? And is part of every like group chat I'm on, effectively. So 70% of a solution there, and 70% of a solution for things like the decentralized systems are notoriously terrible at usability, right? The consequence of that complexity, the consequence of that flexibility. It's so much easier to create something that is aesthetically compelling and has an integrity and unity of its use when you have Steve Jobs. I guess now we have a sort of yin and yang of Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs, but you know, that gives you so much at the loss of something that you barely notice until you're an activist in China and you realize that there are no VPNs on the App Store because Tim Cook now has to make an agreement with the Chinese government about whatever they do, and he becomes the single point of failure, and people remain okay with that because Steve Jobs is kind of, Tim Cook is kind of like Steve Jobs without the horrible approach to their daughter, but who comes after Tim Cook, right? Like this is the trap, the centralization trap. So we see these consequences of centralization, and we see, in some ways, that the moment has been prepared for, right? That all of those academics, all of those computer scientists, perceiving these as problems, building stuff into the existing system, gives us the potential to build alternatives, right? That give you sort of 100% proof of that. And yet, you know, so how long have I been talking? I've been talking about 15 minutes. I want that the record show, this is the first time I've mentioned blockchain. So that's a nice record, I think, for people who are cryptocurrency adjacent. But I'm not going to say necessarily great things about it. I think one of the criticisms of this space is that the blockchain as an idea was invented 15 years ago, and what are the applications, right? This is not like, let's do the calculation, right? If the internet started in 1969, I think it was really only taking off in sort of 83, 84 and getting the bugs out. So, I mean, okay, comparable, but still, we've had a lot of these tools and amazing toys, but we haven't been able to use them and deploy them as truly viable alternatives. Because if they were viable alternatives, we wouldn't have seen this move to centralization. And certainly, I mean, in my role, one of the things that I hope you'll get to see in the next talk is wandering the decentralized space. It's incredibly vibrant at the moment. I mean, not just, I think, because of sort of the capital input of money that the crypto boom provided, but actually also as a social movement. Some of the people I know here from DWebCamp, which I think can well be described as sort of God, I'm almost going to say that it's a Burning Man for, like, I don't know, de-web hippies, but I won't say that and delete that. It's a place where people who recognize the social problems of centralization are attempting to craft those things, absent and from, but interacting with the very sort of commercial drive, I think, of a lot of the current space. So anyway, we have all of these toys, and it's not just blockchain. So to pluck IPFS, right? So IPFS is a content addressing system. The reason why Juan and his team built it is because if you want to be able to store and retrieve data without a kind of central arbiter, one of the things you need to do is not to include the location of the data in the little pointer, the little URL, the web address that enables you to access it. Because if you have all of this data stored, but the URL you give has Facebook or Google or Apple or S3 in it, you're basically creating that centralization problem again. So content addressability says, I want this data, I don't care where it's stored, I just want you to get it. And that's one of those things that if you get it right, enables you to pull out some of the centralizing instincts, including DNS of the internet. Things like CRDTs, which usually I try and expand acronyms, but I can never remember what CRDT stands for. But CRDT is being a way that, look it up, that we can collaborate and essentially do distributed resolution of collectively operated databases, right? Things like capabilities and object capabilities, which means that we can solve that problem of how do we control access without having someone like Mark Zuckerberg being the person who knows who has access to what and can change that. Problems that need to be solved in order to build a decentralized environment that have been very tricky to solve and integrate, but are now, I wouldn't say close to solution, but what we have is implementations of those academic ideas where we didn't necessarily have them before. So we knew that we would need public key cryptography. Public key cryptography was an incredibly essential part of the thinking that went into how we created a private internet. When we went to implement that, we realized that, well, it's okay having public key, but how do we explain and give that power to individuals, right? How do they understand intuitively what's going on? Where are, how do we teach them to understand where their keys are? I realize I'm clutching my pocket because I have that problem with real keys as well. Where are my keys? Okay, they're there, good. The challenge of rolling over keys, right? The challenge of, how do we socially help people who no longer know where their keys are, right? Where they've lost their keys. How do we build those things? Those are complicated implementation problems, which when you have a lot of money in a big company, it's better not to try and solve those problems because you've got a much easier answer that actually traps people in your existing ecosystem. Well, independently in places outside of that, that particular kind of incentive model in academia and in the huge environment of free software, which of course found its origins just a few feet from here, in that space of collective distributed decentralized development, these tools are beginning to come into fruition. So I managed to get through a lot of this description without using the words open learning or education, but I think this is like the key moment here, because what we have is this cycle. We have a really firm academic background built on some of the thinking that has been going on in here and other spaces for, I again, I do the calculation for 40, 50 years, right? And still continues, right? Tim Berners-Lee is, as we speak, working to solve some of these problems with Solid. There continues to be a really strong engine of decentralizing thought coming out of academia. We now have, and hopefully we will be able to showcase some of the people who are really digging into some of the niggly details about implementing decentralized computation, authentication, provenance that you will see in the sort of showcase that we're giving. And again, like these are people who are not necessarily, you know, building on the trademark or whatever tools that I mentioned, contractually mentioned, required to mention at the beginning of my talk, but the general milieu of decentralized technologies. But what we haven't yet crossed over is the chasm of general and widespread use. And this is really the purpose for me of coming to this and convening this salon, right? It's obviously clear that open education and open learning is sits in that same space of understanding the dangers of a centralized system and realizing that it can only really continue as a social good and really as something that just can exist in the world without some element of decentralization, right? The elephant in the room as we give this salon is that we're in a room that could probably fit an elephant, but there are only one of them, right? And the constant problem with education, the problem with that challenge of enticing people to learn so that they can go out and be nerd sniped by actual problems in the real world and have the toolkit to solve them, right? That cycle of building interest and equipping a global community with the tools it needs to solve the problems that are pressing. The challenge has always been, as Chris said, right? Like, you know, we have the current technologies we have, decentralized technologies are salons, and we know that in a world of billions of people, we cannot quite scale those to match and address the problems that we face. It's clearly a problem space that is well matched to the tools and the environment that we're building. We have some of the shared understanding about what an open society involves. And you know, I want to convey that like people have right now very different and polarized ideas about what an open society is or whether an open society itself is a good thing. And I think one of the nice things here is that for a moment we can put that to one side perhaps and discuss a common intention of a world where facts are free and lies are costly, where information doesn't have to be free, but should be as freely available as possible and find its way to the people who can best use it for positive good. And that everybody in the space, no matter your origin or no matter your current privilege or position, should have not only an opportunity to contribute, but be directed and encouraged through education, through the social systems, to be able to watch the structure of interpretation of computer programs from Mexico City and suddenly be the person who can solve that problem, because we need 4 billion, is it 4 billion? Billions of people's minds on these problems. We need billions of nerds sniped with the problems of climate change, of scale, of resource allocation to be able to solve these problems. Okay, so that's my nerd snipe to you. We have a bunch of tools. They're super interesting. They're technically interesting. You will get into the weeds today, and that will be fun. We will be clearly sitting here going, can you use this? Like, is this something that we can build into what we do in the future? And you'll see some examples of that. But we're very aware of that gulf. We're very acutely aware that there is a challenge here of that we failed at. 15, 20 years ago, right? You built, our predecessors built an amazing system that was designed to be centripetal, right? To pull out the power, to extract the power and distribute it. And we did that for a while, and then gravity took over, and the power reassembled itself really 50 or 60 miles from where we had first made that explosion. It's a tragedy to me when I live in San Francisco, but Boston faces the same challenges, where you sit there going, we try to throw out this power, we try to throw out and distribute knowledge and education and technology and the capabilities of digital technology as far as we could when we built this system. And now the centers of those powers are, tens of miles away from where that explosion first happened. So that's our challenge, right? That's the elephant in the room here. We want to work out how it's great for us all to be here, but we have to work out how to build something here that will project outwards much more widely. So yeah, okay, good. I guess we're ahead of time. I don't know. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It feels a little strange to go, oh, salons, dude, technology is great. I'm just going to keep talking. But and given that I've been very poor at introducing what FFDW and Filecoin and all of these things are, I'm happy to also take questions on that and kind of what's been happening in the last sort of couple of years and what we anticipate happening in the next year. So, Nathan.
I'm Nathan Freitas with Guardian Project. My pronouns are he, him. There was a discussion I had with folks at the Berkman Klein Center and maybe around here, and just around the time that Filecoin, that paper came out, and early IPFS, and that we sort of had this joking thread called the re-centralization of the decentralized web.
Yeah.
And part of this was the idea of like, when we had this dual excitement and fear that of the big cloud providers, folks down the road like Akamai, Amazon, the CDN saying, oh, we love this decentralized. And like you said, within their networks, they're already building on
these. Know this stuff, right?
But sort of saying, yep, we fully endorse IPFS, and like Cloudflare is doing, we're running a gateway now. We are running the best performing gateway to the decentralized web. Or we're going to run all of these nodes, right? We're going to be a backbone for Filecoin and this Amazon cloud, perhaps, Right. And in my work with Tor Project, we've dreamt of the same things. Can we get AWS to support running Onion servers? Right. And much of the Tor infrastructure runs physically in these same networks. Right. Are the protocols themselves what is important? Or how much do we really need to get back to the day where I'm running my mail server under my coffee table in my living room?
Happy days. So yeah, when you took the microphone, Nathan, I was like, oh God, this is actually going to be a hard question rather than, could you explain CRDTs? So yeah, right. And like part of my job, actually, I mean, the irony is not lost on me that like I work for a very centralized foundation in a decentralized space. And that part of the job of that, if any of you have read Isaac Asimov's Foundation, I feel this is an audience that might have done, right? It's this idea that you have a secret society that makes sure the rest of society isn't run by secret societies. And that's part of what you do, right? Is you're constantly going, okay, how do we make sure that this system doesn't jump the rails, right? Doesn't short circuit. I look at the stats with IPFS and like how much of that is actually run on cloud infrastructure. Does it matter? That's one of the questions, right? The content addressability feature could just be an escape valve, right? There was a period where people weren't scared about Google because the argument was, well, if Google gets too powerful, I can just switch to Bing, right? And I don't think that was an illusion, right? I think that was a genuine kind of feeling. And right now, the fact that I am able to switch to, oh God, what am I trying out this week? Kaji.com, right? And I'm using that is a constraint on those organizations, but it's kind of a passive constraint, right? It may discipline them into not doing terrible things because they know they could lose people, but it means that they invest in other ways to hold you down. So there's always going to be this process of dynamically being able to pull people away, and regulation can play a part in that as well. Can a technology do that on its own? I don't think so, but it's necessary, right? You need to be able to build something that has that capability to shift, and you can change the gradient of that moving through technology. But that just makes it easier, and there still has to be that sucking pressure. Let me give the other thing. Like, I think so some of the people you'll hear speak today, Christine and others, were involved in the development of ActivityPub, which was the protocol that enabled those of you who follow Twitter X drama, when Mr. Musk took over Twitter, it was the thing that enabled people to go and build and take advantage of a federated alternative in Mastodon, right? And then there was a big discussion afterwards about, well, did that fail or not? Because only 2 million people moved into that network. Well, failure and success are always relative, right? That would not have happened if those protocols haven't existed. It could happen more if that gradient, if the tropism of movement was more drastic. Those are 2 million people who were willing to take that small bump that existed because they were so pissed off with what Twitter had become. But most people, they're not. So what we're looking at in this space is not a lot of our work is how to replicate some of the advantages that centralized systems offered. Now we're in the situation where we go, how do we offer something that is better than those existing systems? And some of that's, again, kind of academic, right? I can argue that these systems are more private and more secure, but it feels very theoretical. If we can make them more usable and beautiful, then I think that's the thing that pulls people towards them rather than pushes them away. But yeah, the protocols and the technology are kind of just the path. Actually encouraging people to walk down that path is another matter.
Thanks. Thank you, Danny, for a really interesting talk. I'm Kurt Newton, Director of OpenCourseWare. You'll be hearing from me more later today. I want to raise something that's been on my mind very much, especially the last couple of weeks, around the social constructs in which we operate. This is one of those, the fish suddenly realizes that they're in water that they weren't as aware of before. Last week, I and a few of my colleagues were at the Open Education Global Conference in Edmonton, Canada, where Indigenous perspectives on open education and knowledge sharing were very much at the center in a really powerful way. And I'm curious what you and others in the room might think about the Indigenous perspective on some of this, that perhaps not all knowledge should be shared as freely as the ideology in which I have existed so comfortably for my whole life exists. And as we are thinking about these technologies and openness, or maybe some certain safeguards, have you in your community and discussions around this stuff had any thought about other ways of handling knowledge sharing beyond just all knowledge should be open all the time to all people? Thanks.
Said we weren't going to talk about this. No.
No.
No. I mean that was sort of one of the things that I was touching on here, right? Like there is a. It's not so much there's a bigger discussion to have. It's the discussion that half of the community that I describe has been the forefront of the discussion, and I will not presume to represent the complexity of that, because that's how we got into this mess in the first place, right? I guess what I would say is that this is, when you have been doing this for like 20 or 30 years, right? I think we're still lagging behind in really integrating that discussion. And everybody has that fish in the sea moment where they go, oh, wait, are we the baddies, right? Are we, is this something that a problem that we're causing with the solutions that we've brought? I would say, and I think maybe this will be a theme that goes through it, that the solutions that are coming up, or the integration of that, rather than having it as a sort of battle over ideologies, is developing now. And some of that stuff is like social solutions, which I think technologists, or the particular technologists that sort of feel that information should be free or open per se, feel uncomfortable about that, not because, excuse me, they disagree, but because they worried if that's a firm enough foundation. So to be specific, right? So let's pick on Mastodon again, right? So Mastodon, one of the consequences of having a defederated or decentralized social network is you lose that ability to control like what's going on. Right now, X, right, is thinking about locking down all its APIs and enforcing its terms of service to prevent AI or normal human beings from scraping its services. That's a choice that you cannot really make technologically in a decentralized or federated thing, because the whole point is the data spreads out through it. Mastodon, because it actually, its original use cases came from a lot of the communities who have these sort of concerns, right? Has a social model where that's just not something that you should do, right? And we will exclude people who scrape and search like that. For technologists, that's not really enough, right? Like, you can't just say, don't do it. Like, you need to create, it's like, that makes it feel like DRM or something, right? But maybe that is enough. So deletion and privacy is one of the things that we will come up in discussion. Okay, I think maybe that's, yeah, okay. One more question? Okay.
Sorry, I can't resist. I can't
question?
resist being the jerk in the audience who does the statement instead of the question.
No, that's please God.
So in the case of, I think a lot of the focus, especially because IPFS and kind of has rose to prominence as like the content address system that people have really seen, and blockchains by far, with maybe the exception of Zcash, right, have kind of had this idea that like, oh, the things are in the public and they can't disappear, and everybody's seeing everything, and like it's still kind of growing out of this weird like Facebook era vibe that's like, actually we're all going to be better if we can all like look at each other's stuff and kind of hold each other accountable or something like that, right? There was no expectation in ActivityPub that things were going to necessarily be public, but that is kind of how things have gone, because the premier application is decentralized Twitter, right? But also, it's not as much of a conversation, I guess, for this audience, for maybe this particular presentation, but you can build, even on top of something like IPFS, more private, more intentionally shared stuff, right? Like, so Tahoe LAFS, a well-known example where it's content addressed, but only the people who are given access to it can read it, right? And so you can have a more intentional form of sharing and knowledge transfer where not everybody has access to everything, that's privacy preserving. But I think one of the problems is that it tends to drop to the bottom because we start thinking about robustness, and it's easier once you start thinking about robustness to start thinking about the public side of things.
Yeah, I think so. Is Holmes here yet? Holmes are coming. Oh no! Oh, that's a tragedy. So Holmes Wilson is working on a thing called Whisper, which is, I would say, a decentralized kind of Discord, Slack kind of system. And quiet, Whisper, quiet. We're running out of nouns for not very loud. Right. That's SSH. Anyway, Holmes's system does use IPFS, but as we'll and Ian is next, and I'm eating into his time. But one of the presumptions that when we talk about IPFS is it's a public network. It's like the web. Holmes's system uses IPFS, but on a private IPFS network. And so this is one of those places where I think your consideration kicks in, right? And it becomes more of less of a technical thing, but as you say, more an ideological thing, right? We're in an environment where the model of open learning and open courseware is very strongly connected to that idea of an open web, but we know that a huge amount of the discussion and sharing that goes on now goes on private group chats. And that's not bad, right? That's just how we replicate the needs of society in the technology we built. It feels a little weird to us because our ideology is built on this idea that everything should be open, but it doesn't. I think you're absolutely right. It's not a presumption of the technology. Okay.